So the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X/S have not even been out for 3 months, and already I'm seeing people talk about the next gen mid console upgrades, the PlayStation 5 Pro as it's being called, and what I'm going to now start calling the Xbox Series X squared. I think that's pretty clever, don't you? So anyway, I want to give my thoughts about the possible mid-gen console refreshes we may get this generation, and honestly why I feel they're not as needed or necessary. Now, a lot of people honestly, I think, are just sort of bringing this up because they're looking at the previous generation, the eighth generation, where we got a PlayStation 4 Pro and we got an Xbox One X. And they're sort of looking at those systems and they're saying, okay, well, it's just obvious they're going to do it again, right? In 4 years, we're going to get an upgraded PlayStation 5 and an upgraded Series X. But I just don't see it. One thing we have to keep in mind is that what happened in Gen 8 was the first time anything like that has happened in a generation. I don't think there has ever been an instance where we got a mid-gen console refresh. I mean, there have been instances where after 4 or 5 years of a console's release, we actually got a new generation. In fact, prior to the 7th generation of consoles, which was really kind of forced to be prolonged because of the 2008-2007 recession that just lasted a very, very long time. But prior to that, your standard normal console generation was anywhere from like 5 years, 6 years maybe at the most, and we got new hardware. Honestly, that hasn't actually been that long ago, but I think it's because of the longevity of the generations sort of being spread out anywhere from the greater part of a decade now. It's now that we sort of are committed to our hardware a lot longer, and as a result, these generations seem to last a long time, and it feels to us significantly longer than it actually may be. And so there's a lot more that these consoles have to do now. I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that last generation, when the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One launched, they were already underperforming below the expectations of consumers. And so what happened is, I think that we were all sort of heading into the Gen 8 thinking, oh, we're going to be able to play games at 1080p 60 frames per second now, and this is going to be great. It's going to be the era where we're finally going to be stabilizing the visuals, we're going to get a smoother frame rate and all that stuff. And I think we saw definitely a more emphasis on 60 FPS gameplay, but the resolution quality actually didn't increase whatsoever. And then you sort of look at sort of the cross-gen games, and it was really about the playability of the experience. I mean, towards the end of 2013, I mean, the PS3 and the 360 were really being stretched thin. I mean, they were being stretched in actually a year before that. And a lot of games started coming out that weren't even hitting their 30 FPS target frame rates. And so it was like we desperately needed the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One to just actually have playability in our games. And so these consoles launched, and they actually launched with very underpowered and sort of lackluster performance, especially coming from me because I had built a computer back in the beginning of 2012 with my infamous building a PC gaming video that you can still watch on this channel. And I was already sort of getting significantly better visuals and sort of next-gen visual actually at the time from just playing games on my PC. I remember when I played Crysis 3, I was like, wow, this looks incredible. When I played Far Cry 3, the disparity between how that game looked on my PC versus how it actually looked on PS3 and 360 was clearly a generation apart. And so we got a lot of these experiences that were really sort of pushing the graphical bar, and also the playability and what these consoles could actually do. It was severely affected on these last gen machines. And so enter the PS4 and Xbox One in 2013, and it's sort of like, okay, I feel like we just sort of transition slowly to a more playable experience, but most of everything starts looking the same, and that was something I felt that, kind of was sort of more apparent in this past previous generation, is that the graphics took a lot longer to actually give you a noticeable upgrade in visual fidelity, and it was much slower, sort of drawn out through the entire generation. So I think if you look at sort of the end of Gen 8 and sort of the quality and visuals and where we're at, I mean, I was very, very impressed with a lot of games visually, and a lot of those games actually look like they should be, or could, very well be on a PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X game. I think back at like Death Stranding, and I'm like, wow, the character rendering in Death Stranding versus that and, like, let's say Killzone Shadowfall running on the same engine, a launch title for the PS4. I mean, it looks a generation apart. It's very realistic. It's very sort of broad in its level of fidelity and what we could actually do and the effects and stuff that we pull off. And the engines got a lot more efficient with streaming and actually pulling off these sort of high fidelity characters and things like that, and also these really sort of more dense environments. But the biggest reason why we actually ended up getting a PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One actually had nothing to do with the visual quality. It had to do with the arrival of affordable 4K TVs. 4K TVs were around when the PS4 and Xbox One actually launched, and they were somewhat, affordable, I would say. You definitely had to spend closer to $1,000, if not even over that, to actually get a decent set. But it was when we started actually seeing 4K TVs start dripping down basically in price to like the $500 budget range, $500 and below for 4K TVs. And then you have these consoles here that couldn't even run games at a native 1080p consistently. A lot of them having dynamic resolutions, more often than not on the Xbox One in particular, running at below, 1080p, 900p, even 720p. In a lot of these cases. And so we had these consoles that couldn't even output games at a quarter of the resolution of what our mainstream sets that you could buy from, your local electronics shop could give you. And so you're essentially playing this sub full HD game on your 4K TV, and it looks super, super blurry. And so the answer to basically this was, and really honestly needed to be, a mid-gen console refresh, where we saw both Sony and Microsoft, Sony going first with the PlayStation 4 Pro, and then Microsoft taking a year longer to release the more powerful Xbox One X. Now, what's cool here is that actually both of these companies' approach to basically getting you to a 4K experience and being able to utilize your new TV was actually drastically different. Sony sort of took the more post-processed rendering approach. They said, okay, we're going to fake it. We're going to give you checkerboard rendering and temporal upscaling in our games so that it looks effectively native 4K. But the return is that we don't have to use as much power. We don't have to build this super, extremely expensive console with the latest graphics card and stuff. We can actually just sort of fake it and rely on the GPU rendering power of the engine, or whatever you want to say, to actually output an image that looks acceptable and high res on your 4K TV. And for the most part, I feel like that actually was a good approach. I look at a lot of like Guerrilla Games is like Horizon Zero Dawn looks excellent. Death Stranding, which I just mentioned before, looks excellent. Ratchet and Clank from Insomniac look excellent on the PlayStation 4 Pro, especially running on a 4K TV. A lot of those games do actually effectively, to the eye, look native 4K in motion. And the side effects of actually using checkerboard rendering weren't so bad. Digital Foundry likes to zoom into like 400% to show you the pixel breakup, but during general play, it's invisible to the naked eye. You're not really going to notice that unless a game does it really, really poorly. And I think back at like Red Dead Redemption 2 running on the PS4 Pro, where it should look, a lot better than it actually did, but because the I guess the rendering technique that they used for their checkerboard rendering wasn't as efficient, or just wasn't as robust as a lot of other studios did. And then you saw Microsoft, on the other hand, which basically used a brute force approach. They said, we're going to build this super powerful console that's going to actually give you native 4K in games and going to get you closer to a native resolution. And so incoming, we have the Xbox One X, which basically I think Microsoft did a very good job of delivering on that promise. I mean, I think about Metro Exodus on the Xbox One X, and that game still to this day blows me away visually on that console. It looks almost a generation apart, like it could be an Xbox Series X / PS5 game. The level of fidelity especially running that game running at native 4K, and even if it is 30 frames per second, is astounding. Red Dead Redemption 2 was native 4K on the Xbox One X, and it looked incredible. And what's actually more impressive here is that when you see these games running at these high resolutions and they look so impressive, and then you hear, like in the case of Red Dead Redemption 2, that the game was actually running lower than the lowest preset on PC on consoles, and it still looked that good. Or in the case of Metro Exodus, the game didn't even have tessellation. And to be honest, I mean, I was so blown away by the visuals still. I didn't notice the fact that bricks weren't sticking out more on the wall, than they did, or the ground textures weren't as raised, or didn't have as much depth as they do on the PC. I mean, I think both of these consoles, we saw, a different approach to basically taking care or getting you to a higher resolution and taking advantage of basically your 4K sets. But that was the core reason behind us having a mid-generation console refresh, is that we had the arrival of a 4K TVs that were affordable, that people could pick up for a couple $100s or so. But then we had these consoles that couldn't even output to a quarter resolution in most cases for a lot of these games. And so you had this very blurry, very terrible presentation on these 4K sets. And that was basically the Sony and Microsoft's answer to this issue. Now, when I think about the 9th generation, I'm like, wow, I'm already seeing a good handful of games running actually native 4K on these new consoles. I mean, I just played Spider-Man Miles Morales, and I played it in the fidelity mode. I know it's been patched up to also have the performance ray tracing mode as well, but there's so many extra graphical effects, and I really wanted to see how beautiful the game could look just maxed out. So I actually played through the entirety of that game in the fidelity mode, which is native 4K, and incredible, all these nice high-res effects and ray tracing and all that stuff. And it really is impressive. I mean, that's one of those games that you sort of look at and it takes you a little while, but once you start actually playing through it, it's like, okay, you're noticing where the next generation element is coming from. You notice the more busy streets and the highways and stuff like that. You notice that when you're walking down a hall, the really nice reflections and just the roughness of the reflections as well that they sort of alter. You notice that the character modeling looks almost photorealistic at times. It's really super impressive. And it's a game I think at first glance you look at and you're like, okay, this is a much higher resolution version of the PS4 game. It just has ray tracing. And I was actually really blown away by Miles Morales' visuals later when I started playing the game, and I really started understanding, okay, this city has a real feel and placement to it that I didn't really get in the prior game, as beautiful as Spider-Man 2018 was. And even right now, I'm playing through Demon's Souls right now on PS5, and it's a 1440p game in its performance mode. You can play it in native 4K, but the drop 30 FPS in that game is well, it's not a trade-off that you want to make. It's a game that really kind of requires to be 60 FPS. But even as it is 1440p, it's a high enough resolution still where it does look sharp enough on a 4K TV. And it's not such a drastic difference going to 4K and going to 1440p, but you sort of feel it with the performance more so in that game. And so the bottom line with me sharing you guys all of this is that I sort of look at the PlayStation 5 and I look at the Series X and I say to myself, what is the point? What is the selling point for a mid-generation console refresh of these machines? Because before, it was the rise of affordable 4K televisions and then consoles that couldn't even run games at a native quarter resolution of those TVs. And so it just looked like shit. And it made sense in that market because it was a very sort of unique situation. I don't see, I want to throw 8K out there, but these consoles technically are supposed to support 8K. They're advertised to support 8K. I know the Xbox Series X does actually support 8K resolution. The PS5, funny enough, actually says 8K on the box, but doesn't actually support it through the console outputs. that it was confirmed. So I guess that's coming in a future update somehow. But I mean, who's buying 8K TVs? There's no 8K content for you to virtually watch whatsoever, besides maybe a literal handful of like sports and different sort of, you know, pre-made content that is sort of designed to sort of wow you, but it's not anything that you would watch. I mean, Christ, we have 4K movies being sold to us, and not even every 4K Blu-ray that you buy is native 4K. A lot of those are even 2K digital intermediates that have just been upscaled to be 4K. It's not even a native 4K film. And so if we have 4K movies on the market that aren't even 4K most of the time, and then we have movies that are actually being recorded today, not even at as high of a resolution as 8K, and gaming in 8K, I mean, fucking forget about it. You have the RTX 3090, which can pull it off, but with playable frame rates, I mean, you're going to have to use DLSS. And I think maybe that's probably what we're going to be looking towards in the future, is like these different unique rendering techniques that we can use that actually sort of fake the resolution, but it looks high enough. I just don't see the appeal or any use or necessary requirement for us to have, you know, a mid-gen console refresh. A lot of people want to bring up performance. Oh, what about 60 FPS in every game? I mean, hell, developers can do 60 FPS in every game now if they want to. If a developer wants to sit there and say, yeah, I want my game to run at 1080p, 60 frames per second, hell, we can do 120 frames per second now on these machines. Just sacrifice the resolution, you know? But sometimes the developers have a specific format in which they want you to experience the game. And some games do actually benefit from a higher resolution more so than just a super high frame rate, you know? And playability is extremely important and stuff, but I mean, a lot of us, I think, have become accustomed to these nice, beautiful high-res images. And I don't know about you guys, but I like graphics. You know, I love pretty things. I like to sit there and be wowed every once in a while, you know, and if I can enjoy the game how it's meant to be enjoyed, and if the frame rate is steady no matter what it is, then I can actually sit down and enjoy the game. So I just don't see the mass appeal or any necessary requirement that a PlayStation 5 Pro and an Xbox Series X squared would yield in today's market. You know, 4K TVs, a lot of us have them. A lot of people still use 1080p as well. You know, let's keep it real. Some people still have 1080p. A lot of people game off their monitors, in which case they're using 1440p or 1080p. A lot of people aren't actually using 4K monitors, you know. So it's like, you know, with 4K not fully adopted, and then we have a lot of movies being sold to us that aren't even native 4K to begin with. I mean, the market just isn't even there for 8K. And even if it was, we actually have advertised to us that these consoles could at least output to 8K. And I'm sure for simpler games, I mean, I think about Ori and the Will of the Wisp that I played on the Xbox Series X, you know, and there's an option for playing at 6K 60 FPS in that game, super sampled 6K 60 FPS. And yeah, you know, it's like, okay, those simpler games you can get closer to 8K, but your AAA game, you're not going to do it. You're not going to be playing Cyberpunk 2077 in 8K. You're not going to be playing, you know, the next Call of Duty in 8K. You're just not. And honestly, it's like, why would you want that? I think all of us would much rather prefer a nice, you know, high enough resolution with a super nice, steady, high frame rate from these games as well. And in the case of like Call of Duty, you know, they give you that option. Okay, you want the ray tracing, you can play it in 4K. If you want the 120 frames per second, you can play higher than 1080p most of the time, yes, but you get that super smooth refresh rate. So I just don't see it becoming a thing, and I honestly think it's just not. Again, the last console generation was an exception. It was an exception in a lot of cases. You know, the consoles launched very underpowered. We didn't get a massive boost in visual fidelity, and until much later in the console's generation life cycle, where we actually saw, you know, okay, the graphics did jump pretty considerably, but still, you know, in today's market, where let's say the common consumer has a 4K TV, you know, it's like, oh, where's the PS5 Pro? Like, what more is it going to do for them? You know, what more is the Xbox Series X squared going to do for them? We have 4K Blu-ray players now in these consoles as well, if you want to do that. Most people are streaming, but we have that option as well. So I don't see it happening. I don't see the point of it, but maybe I'm not thinking of something that you guys are, right? So share in the comments with me what you guys feel. Do you think we need a PS5 Pro? Do you think we need a Series X squared? Or do you think that we're perfectly fine with these consoles for, let's say, another 7 to 8 years? I think that Sony and Microsoft both launch these consoles to be pretty powerful. I mean, there's a lot of power in these. We're basically getting RTX 2060 Super to like 2070 levels of performance a lot of times in these machines. And so, I mean, those are pretty decent graphics cards. You know, those are still what people would consider, I would say, to be sort of high-end graphics cards. Let's say upper mid-tier to low high-end graphics cards. You know, somewhere in between there. And I think that's a really good base level. And you know, I'm still seeing a lot of these games being able to hit native 4K as well, and in some cases even 60 FPS. So yeah, let me know what you guys think, and we'll go on from there.